The air in Mr. Abernathy's mahogany-paneled office was thick with the scent of old paper, leather, and the cloying sweetness of funereal lilies. Elara felt a phantom chill, a cold that had nothing to do with the weak autumn sun filtering through the tall, mullioned windows. It had been 2 weeks since her father, Richard Vance, had succumbed to a final, brutal stroke, and the world had tilted off its axis. Across the gleaming expanse of the partner's desk sat Julian, her stepbrother. At 32, he was the picture of refined sympathy. His dark hair impeccably styled. His bespoke suit a somber charcoal gray. He had his mother's sharp, handsome features and a practiced solemnity that never quite reached his eyes. Those eyes, a cool, calculating gray, flickered toward Elara for a moment, a micro-expression of something she couldn't name. Pity, perhaps, or something closer to triumph. Elara, at 28, felt like a ghost in her own life. Her grief was a heavy cloak, but beneath it, a thread of unease had been pulling tighter ever since her father's passing. Julian had been a constant presence in Richard's final months. His solicitude so perfect, so suffocating, that it had left little room for anyone else. Mr. Abernathy, a man whose jowls seemed to have absorbed the gravity of 1,000 such meetings, cleared his throat. "Thank you both for coming. As you know, we are here to execute the last will and testament of your father, Richard Sterling Vance." He slid a pair of reading glasses onto his nose and unfolded the stiff document with a series of loud cracks that made Elara flinch. "Standard preliminaries, bequests to staff, charitable donations," he mumbled, his finger tracing the lines of text. Here we are. Article 4. Regarding the primary estate. Elara's hands clenched in her lap. The Vance estate was more than a home. It was a legacy. A sprawling stone manor set on 300 acres of rolling Connecticut countryside, filled with art, memories, and the soul of the family her father had built. She and Richard had spent countless hours in the library, the scent of his pipe smoke mingling with her architectural sketches as he'd taught her about line, form, and most importantly, foundation. "A structure is only as strong as what it's built on, Ellie," he'd always say. "I, Richard Sterling Vance," Abernathy read, his voice a droning monotone, "being of sound mind and body, do hereby bequeath the entirety of my estate, including all properties real and personal, all shares in Vance Holdings LLC, my complete art collection, and the contents of all financial accounts to my beloved stepson Julian Croft." The words didn't register at first. They were a string of nonsensical syllables, a language from a foreign land. Elara stared at the lawyer, waiting for the correction, for the part where he would say her name. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Julian let out a quiet, performative breath. "Oh, Dad," he whispered, his voice catching with false emotion. "What?" Elara's voice was a croak. She looked from Abernathy's impassive face to Julian's carefully constructed mask of surprise. That's not possible. There must be a mistake." Abernathy coughed, avoiding her gaze. "There is a further provision. For my daughter, Elara Vance." Relief, sharp and dizzying, washed over her. Course. Her father was a man of grand gestures. Perhaps he'd structured it in some strange way. "To Elara," the lawyer continued, "I leave a trust fund in the amount of $5,000 to be used as she sees fit. It is my deepest regret that her choices have led her down a path so divergent from the one I envisioned for her and for the future of this family." He paused, then added, "The will is accompanied by a personal letter for you, Elara." He pushed a crisp, cream-colored envelope across the desk. Her father's familiar, looping script spelled her name. But the words Abernathy had just read were utterly alien. Disappointment. Her father had been her greatest champion. He'd celebrated her decision to become an architect, proudly displaying her university projects in his study. This was a lie. A grotesque, twisted lie. Numbly, she opened the letter. The sentences were clipped, the tone cold and formal. It spoke of her bohemian lifestyle, her lack of business acumen, and his ultimate heartbreaking conclusion that the family legacy would be safer in Julian's more capable hands. The signature at the bottom was a shaky, spidery version of his own. I don't understand, she said, her voice trembling as she dropped the letter. He would never. We spoke the week before the stroke. He was so proud of the schematic I'd shown him for the new city library. Julian finally looked at her. His mask of grief now layered with a gentle condescension. Elara, Dad was. He was struggling toward the end. He had moments of clarity, but he worried. He worried you weren't grounded. Grounded. Her voice rose, sharp with disbelief. I have a career. A life I built myself, just like he always taught me to. It's all right, Elara, Julian said. His voice a soothing balm of poison. He reached across the desk as if to comfort her, but his hand stopped short of touching hers. Nothing has to change, really. The house will always be your home. You can stay as long as you need to. I'll take care of everything. The humiliation landed like a physical blow. A guest. He was offering to let her be a guest in her own home. In that moment, the final puzzle piece clicked into place. The feigned surprise, the perfect sympathy, the months of ingratiating himself with her ailing father. It was all a meticulously crafted performance. And as he spoke, she saw it. The briefest, almost imperceptible smirk that he couldn't quite suppress. It was a flicker of pure, unadulterated victory. The rest of the meeting passed in a blur. Elara sat in stony silence, the forged letter clutched in her hand. When it was over, she followed Abernathy out into the hallway, leaving Julian to bask in his new kingdom. Mr. Abernathy, she said, her voice low and firm. I want to see the codicil. The document that changed the original will. The lawyer's face became a mask of professional obfuscation. Elara, I'm not sure that's wise. I'm not asking if it's wise. I'm asking to see it. Now. With a heavy sigh. He led her back into a records room and retrieved a thin file. He handed her a single sheet of paper, dated 1 week before Richard's final stroke. It contained the new text for Article 4. At the bottom was the signature she had seen on the letter. It was her father's signature, yes, but it was the signature of a man whose hand was no longer his own, a hand guided by medication, confusion, and she was now certain, coercion. He was heavily medicated that day, she stated, her gaze fixed on the wavering ink. I was there. He barely recognized me. He was deemed to be of sound mind by the witnesses, Abernathy said stiffly, gesturing to 2 other signatures. A nurse and a notary Julian had brought to the house. It's all legally binding, my dear. I'm truly sorry. Sorry. The word was a pathetic offering against the scale of this theft. She knew, with chilling certainty, that a legal challenge would be fruitless. It would be her word against a notarized document and a stepbrother who could paint her as a bitter, disinherited daughter. She would lose. She walked back to the office doorway. Julian was standing by the window, looking out over the city, his city. He turned, and the pretense was gone. His face was cold, triumphant. I assume Abernathy showed you, he said. It's airtight. You did this, she whispered, the enormity of his betrayal settling in her bones. You poisoned him against me. You waited until he was weak and confused. He saw reason, Julian corrected her smoothly. He saw that I was the one who cared about his legacy, while you were off playing with blueprints and pipe dreams. I stayed. I managed things. I earned this. The cold fury that had been simmering inside her began to solidify into something harder, something more dangerous. 'Twas ice. Enjoy it, she said, her voice devoid of emotion. Enjoy the house, the money, the name you were never born with. He smiled then, a genuine cruel smile. Oh, I will. And Elara, about my earlier offer. I've reconsidered. It would be uncomfortable for us both to have you in the house. I think it's best you gather your personal belongings and leave. My driver will take you wherever you need to go. I'll give you 24 hours. He was casting her out. Not just from her home, but from her life, her history, her father's memory. It was the ultimate humiliation. Elara looked at him, at the man who had stolen her entire world from under her feet. There was no pleading, no screaming, no satisfying eruption of rage that he could savor. She simply met his gaze, her own eyes as cold and gray as his. And in that profound, chilling silence, she gave a single, deliberate nod. It was not a sign of defeat. It was a declaration of war. Quiet, patient, architectural war. He had taken her foundation, but he had forgotten one thing his stepfather had taught her. She knew how to build. And she knew, with absolute certainty, how to bring a structure crashing down. The door to apartment 3B creaked in protest, opening into a space that smelled of dust and damp. It was a shoebox, a grim little rectangle with a single window that looked out onto a symphony of brick and fire escapes. The life Elara had known, of sun-drenched sitting rooms, sprawling lawns, and the quiet dignity of ancestral portraits, had been compressed into this sad, cramped box on the other side of town. This was her new reality. The 24 hours Julian had granted her had been a frantic, heartbreaking triage of her life. She'd packed clothes, personal documents, and a few sentimental objects, each one a fresh stab of grief. The hardest to leave were her architectural books and sketches, a library of her own making, now hostage in her father's, in Julian's, study. The $5,000, a pittance meant to add insult to injury, was nearly gone after the first month's rent, a security deposit, and the purchase of a second-hand mattress. Pride warred with desperation. She began taking on freelance drafting work online, tedious, soulless projects for developers who wanted cookie-cutter condos. The pay was abysmal, but it kept the lights on and provided a distraction from the gnawing emptiness. Her social circle, once a warm and vibrant tapestry, had unraveled. Calls went unreturned. Friends she'd known for years offered polite, distant condolences before murmuring excuses. Julian, now the magnanimous steward of the Vance fortune, had been busy, spinning a tale of a devoted stepson forced to take the reins from a flighty, irresponsible sister. In a world that worshipped wealth and power, the story was an easy one to sell. She was an outcast, a pariah, a ghost haunting the edges of a life that was no longer hers. Some nights, despair was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest until she could barely breathe. She would lie on the lumpy mattress, tracing the cracks in the ceiling, the sheer injustice of it all burning behind her eyes. But her father's voice, a warm and steady memory, would cut through the darkness. "Don't get mad, Ellie. Get smart. Find the load-bearing walls." Her revenge couldn't be a passionate, reckless act. Had to be a design. Had to be architectural. Patient, precise, and systematic demolition. Her salvation, the key to her entire blueprint, came from the one thing Julian had overlooked, an object too small and insignificant for his greedy eyes. It was her father's favorite watch, a vintage Patek Philippe he was never without. In the chaos of her departure, she had slipped it from his bedside table, a final, tangible connection to him. One particularly bleak evening, while cleaning the watch, her finger caught on a tiny seam on the back of the heavy leather strap. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Using the tip of a drafting knife, she carefully pried it open. Tucked into a minuscule custom-carved recess was a tiny USB drive, no bigger than her thumbnail. Her father had been a man of contingency plans, a lover of secrets and elegant solutions. "The best safe is the one no one knows exists," he'd once told her, a twinkle in his eye. The drive was encrypted, of course. For weeks, the small apartment was lit by the glow of her laptop screen deep into the night. She tried everything: birthdays, anniversaries, account numbers. Failure after failure met her, a frustrating digital wall. She was about to give up when another memory surfaced, a story he'd told her about his youth, about freedom and the sea. With trembling fingers, she typed in the password, "The Sea Witch," the name of the small, battered sailboat he'd owned in his 20s, a vessel of which no official record remained, a memory he had shared only with her. The drive unlocked. It was as if her father were in the room with her. The drive contained a perfect, hidden mirror of his entire digital life. Scanned documents, private ledgers, a full email archive, and offshore account statements. But the crown jewel, the structural survey of Julian's entire fraudulent life, was a private journal her father had kept for the last 2 years. She read for hours, the words a heartbreaking and infuriating revelation. Richard had not been a fool. He had been growing deeply suspicious of Julian. He documented his stepson's charm turning to pressure, his suggestions becoming demands. He noted large sums of money being siphoned from Vance holdings, funneled into high-risk, off-the-books ventures Julian was running on the side. Julian speaks of legacy, one entry read, but he sees it as a prize to be won, not a trust to be honored. His ambition has a rot in it, a fear for Elara. He resents her not for what she does but for who she is. My daughter. My blood. The final entries were chilling. Her father described feeling unwell, foggy. He mentioned Julian bringing him new vitamin supplements and handling all his calls. He'd been isolating him, weakening him, preparing him for the final desperate move. The USB drive was the weapon, the evidence, the key. But Elara knew that storming into a courtroom now would be a mistake. Julian would bury her in legal fees, tie her up in appeals, and use the press to paint her as a vindictive hysteric. A direct assault was what he would expect. Well, she would not attack the will. The will was the final pillar. The building couldn't fall until the other supports were gone. Spreading her largest sheet of drafting paper on the floor of the tiny apartment, she picked up a pen. At the top she wrote a name. Julian Croft. Beneath it she drew 3 thick columns. The blueprint of his life. Column 1. Reputation. His public image as a savvy philanthropist and businessman, the worthy heir. This was his armor. Column 2. Relationships. His strategic engagement to Isabella Fairchild, the daughter of a powerful old money dynasty. This was his social fortress. Column 3. Wealth. Vance holdings and the personal fortune he'd stolen, the source of his power. This was his engine. This was her project now. Not building but unbuilding. She would take from him, piece by piece, everything he had stolen. She would not use a sledgehammer. She would use a scalpel, tracing the stress points and weaknesses until the entire corrupt structure collapsed under its own weight. She looked at the first column. Reputation. Julian was the newly appointed chairman of the Vance Foundation, the city's most prestigious charitable organization. He was lauded in the society pages as a new generation philanthropist. It was the perfect place to start. A story of a hero is a wonderful thing, she thought, a cold smile touching her lips for the first time in months. But a story of a fallen hero is so much more compelling. The first pillar to fall would be Julian's reputation. It was the most public of his assets and, therefore, the most vulnerable. He had wrapped himself in the cloak of her father's philanthropy, using the Vance Foundation as his stage. From that stage, he projected an image of civic virtue and business acumen, a narrative that made his inheritance seem not just legal but earned. Elara intended to burn that stage to the ground. Her father's digital journal was her guide. In it, Richard had chronicled his alarm over a specific foundation project Julian had championed, a large-scale land purchase in Ecuador, ostensibly for an environmental preserve. But the details were murky, the finances opaque. He calls it conservation, Richard had written, but the numbers look like exploitation. He's using the foundation's good name as cover for something else. Digging into the mirrored hard drive, Elara found the something else. It was a chain of emails between Julian and a shell corporation based in Panama. The plan was audacious in its cynicism. The foundation would purchase the designated preserve land at a grossly inflated price. A significant portion of that money would then be kicked back from the shell corporation to another company, secretly owned by Julian, to fund a speculative lithium mining venture on adjacent land. He was using charity money as his personal seed capital, cloaked in the noble cause of environmentalism. Going to the authorities or the press herself was out of the question. An anonymous tip from a disgruntled source would be too predictable, too easily traced back to the disinherited sister. She needed a proxy, a weapon that could be aimed and fired without revealing the hand that pulled the trigger. She found her weapon in Maria Flores. Maria was a journalist, and a damn good one. Tenacious, hungry, and currently simmering with righteous fury. She had recently been fired from the city's leading newspaper, The Chronicle, after her investigation into a powerful city councilman had gotten a little too close to the paper's publisher. She was now freelancing, writing for a small but respected online investigative journal, and she had a score to settle with the city's untouchable elite. Elara set up a burner email account and a voice modulator. She reached out to Maria, presenting herself as a mid-level employee at Vance Holdings who had stumbled upon something that didn't feel right. She was careful, feeding Maria just enough to ignite her journalistic instincts. She didn't send the damning emails. Instead, she sent a single shipping manifest for a piece of heavy drilling equipment sent to the region in Ecuador, paid for by the Foundation. Its destination was miles away from the supposed nature preserve. "Ask yourself," she wrote, her final sentence a perfectly calibrated hook, "what kind of nature preserve needs a subterranean core sampler?" It was enough. A week later, Maria's first article appeared. It was a masterpiece of insinuation, a carefully worded piece that didn't accuse but asked pointed, uncomfortable questions. Vance Foundation's Green Initiative raises red flags, the headline read. The article highlighted the exorbitant land price, the unusual equipment purchase, and the labyrinthine network of offshore companies involved. Julian's name was mentioned frequently, always next to words like oversight and fiduciary duty. The story spread like wildfire through the city's philanthropic and financial communities. Julian responded immediately, issuing a statement decrying the baseless accusations and shoddy journalism, painting Maria Flores as a disgraced reporter on a vendetta. He was arrogant, dismissive, and it was exactly the mistake Elara had counted on. Now she sent Maria a second, larger breadcrumb. This time, it was a partial list of wire transfers from the Foundation's accounts, showing the money trail leading to the Panamanian Shell Corporation. It was still anonymous, still untraceable, but it was concrete. Maria's follow-up article was devastating. It laid out the financial discrepancies in stark, undeniable detail. The Vance Foundation's board of directors, a collection of old money scions and corporate titans who valued their reputations above all else, began to panic. The whispers started at cocktail parties and in country club locker rooms. Julian Croft, the golden boy, was suddenly looking careless, or worse, corrupt. The board announced an internal investigation. They released a statement emphasizing their commitment to transparency, a clear signal that they were creating distance between themselves and their new chairman. Julian's powerful allies, the people who had flocked to his side after he'd inherited the Vance fortune, began to hedge their bets. Invitations slowed. Calls were directed to voicemail. The final, fatal blow in the first phase of her plan came from Elara herself, in a move of breathtaking audacity. The Vance Foundation's annual charity gala, the glittering centerpiece of the city's social calendar, was a week away. Julian was scheduled to give the keynote address. Using her architectural skills, Elara analyzed the schematics of the grand ballroom at the Pierre Hotel, where the event was held. She identified the audiovisual systems, the projectors, the soundboards. On the night of the gala, she bypassed security using a forged contractor's ID. Her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and icy resolve. Dressed in the black uniform of the A/V crew, she was just another invisible worker in the background. As Julian took the stage, bathed in the warm glow of the spotlight, he was the picture of confidence. He began his speech, his voice smooth and reassuring, dismissing the recent unfortunate rumors and reaffirming the Foundation's noble mission. That's when Elara made her move. She inserted a flash drive into a port on the main control board. As Julian spoke of integrity and transparency, the massive screen behind him flickered. In its place, a single email materialized, magnified for the 500 wealthiest and most influential people in the city to see. It was the email from Julian to his contact in Panama. His voice faltered as a collective gasp swept through the ballroom. Julian froze, his face a mask of horror, illuminated by the glow of his own treachery. Before anyone could react, the screen went black. Elara was already gone, melting back into the shadows and out a service exit. She didn't need to see the fallout. She could imagine it perfectly. The panicked exodus of the guests, the frantic whispers, the cold, furious looks from the board members. Julian, standing alone on a stage that had become his public pillory. The next morning, the headlines were brutal. Julian Croft had resigned as chairman of the Vance Foundation, effective immediately. The board announced a full, independent forensic audit. Elara sat in her tiny apartment, sipping a cup of cheap coffee, and read Maria Flores's triumphant, vindicated article. Pillar 1 had crumbled. Julian's reputation was not just tarnished. It was shattered. He was no longer the worthy heir. He was a pariah. And Elara was just getting started. She turned to her blueprint and drew a firm, satisfying line through the first column. Next up, relationships. With his public reputation in ashes, Julian retreated behind the walls of his remaining fortress. His relationship with Isabella Fairchild. The Fairchilds were old money, a dynasty whose name was a synonym for influence and stability. The impending marriage was Julian's lifeline, a strategic merger that promised to wash away the stain of the foundation scandal and anchor him firmly within the city's unshakable elite. Elara knew that to truly isolate him, she had to sever that anchor. Her father's journal was once again her weapon. Richard had not only been suspicious of Julian's business dealings. He had also been privately disgusted by his character. "He wears his engagement to Isabella like a medal," one entry read. "Yet he speaks of her and her family with such contempt in private. He calls them dinosaurs and brags about how he will modernize and control their family's assets after the wedding. He has no concept of love, only leverage." The journal also mentioned Julian's long-standing affair with a junior executive at Vance Holdings, a woman named Chloe. It was a messy, open secret within the company, one that Julian was too arrogant to believe would ever have consequences. Elara's plan was twofold, designed to detonate the relationship from two sides simultaneously. It required precision, cruelty, and an understanding of the Fairchild family's deepest vulnerabilities, their pride and their legendary aversion to public scandal. First, she hired a discreet private investigator, a former detective who specialized in matrimonial cases. It cost her nearly all of her remaining funds, but it was a necessary investment. She didn't need a lengthy surveillance report. She just needed proof. Within a week, she had it. A series of high-resolution photographs of Julian and Chloe leaving a boutique hotel, their body language intimate and unmistakable. The photos were dated, current, proving this wasn't a past indiscretion. Now she assembled her packages. They were works of art, curated for maximum psychological impact. The first package was for Isabella. Inside a simple, elegant box, she placed glossy prints of the photographs. Beneath them lay photocopied pages from her father's journal, the entries where he detailed Julian's contempt for the Fairchild family. His words highlighted in a subtle blood-red ink. And for the final, devastating touch, she included printouts of emails from the mirrored hard drive. In them, Julian and a friend mocked Isabella's passion for ponies, and her decidedly last-century worldview. There was no note, no explanation. The evidence was left to speak for itself. The second package was for Isabella's father, Marcus Fairchild, the family's formidable, iron-willed patriarch. This package contained no hint of infidelity. Marcus Fairchild was a man who dealt in power and finance, not emotion. So Elara gave him numbers. She included meticulously organized financial records from the USB drive, showing how Julian had used the Fairchild name as collateral to secure high-risk loans for his now-failed mining venture. He had leveraged their good name without their knowledge, putting their reputation in the path of his own implosion. She sent both packages via a bonded, anonymous courier, timed to arrive on the same afternoon. Then she waited. The fallout was swift and spectacular. 2 days later, the city's most influential gossip columnist, a woman Marcus Fairchild secretly kept on retainer, ran an exclusive. "Fairchild Croft engagement off," the headline screamed. The article was a masterclass in controlled demolition. It spoke of irreconcilable differences and a divergence in core values. It quoted an unnamed source close to the Fairchild family who stated that integrity and honor are paramount. There was no mention of an affair or financial misdeeds. The Fairchilds were far too dignified for that. But the message was clear, a public execution delivered with a patrician whisper. Julian was not one of them. He was out. The severing of this relationship was more than a personal blow. It was a financial catastrophe. The quiet backing of the Fairchild empire had been propping Julian up, keeping his creditors at bay in the wake of the foundation scandal. With that support publicly withdrawn, his world began to unravel with breathtaking speed. The banks called in their loans. Business partners, who had been willing to overlook his tarnished reputation as long as he was marrying a Fairchild, vanished overnight. This brought Elara to the third and final pillar: wealth. It was already teetering, and she was ready to deliver the final push. Julian was now in a desperate scramble, liquidating personal assets and using Vance Holdings as his personal piggy bank to cover the margins on his catastrophic side deals. This was the moment Elara had been waiting for. She compiled a final, damning dossier. It was the culmination of everything she had found: the ledgers detailing the embezzlement from Vance Holdings, the contracts for the Ecuadorian land deal, the evidence of wire fraud, and a detailed summary of how company funds were being used to pay off his personal debts. It was a professional, irrefutable audit of his crimes. This time, she sent the package not to a journalist, but directly to the board of directors of Vance Holdings, the same board her father had appointed, men who had known him for decades, and to the company's primary institutional investors. The result was immediate. An emergency board meeting was called. Faced with incontrovertible proof of gross misconduct and embezzlement, they had no choice. Julian was summarily fired from the company his stepfather had built. A team of forensic accountants was brought in to assess the full extent of the damage, and his personal assets were frozen pending multiple investigations. The wealth he had killed for was now a legal cage, and the walls were closing in. A week later, Elara returned to the estate. She didn't need to force her way in. The gate was ajar, the front door unlocked. The house felt cavernous, empty, the silence echoing with failure. She found him where she knew he would be. In her father's study. The room was a disaster. Half-empty bottles of scotch littered the desk. Papers were strewn everywhere. Julian sat in their father's leather chair, a ghost in a stolen life. When he saw her standing in the doorway, he didn't even seem surprised. The fight was gone. "You," he rasped, his voice a broken shell. "It was you. All of it." "Every last piece of it," she confirmed, her voice calm and steady. She walked slowly into the room, the scent of stale whiskey and defeat hanging in the air. He stared at her, a dawning, horrified respect in his eyes. "The reporter. Vigala. Isabella. How?" "You underestimated me," she said simply. "You and my father both taught me about the importance of a strong foundation. You just forgot that I also learned how to spot the weaknesses. How to apply pressure until the whole corrupt structure comes down." He began to ramble then, a pathetic, slurring confession. He admitted to manipulating her father, to switching his medications, to guiding his hand as he signed the codicil. He confessed to everything, the rage and self-pity pouring out of him in a torrent. Elara quietly placed a small digital recorder on the edge of the desk. She had been recording the entire conversation. "It's over, Julian," she said when he finally fell silent. She placed a sheaf of papers on the desk next to the recorder. "This is a lawsuit contesting the will on grounds of fraud and undue influence. With your confession, the evidence I have, and the full weight of the Vance Holdings legal team behind me, you will not only lose, you will go to prison for a very long time." She let that sink in. "Or," she continued, her voice like ice, "you can sign this." She pushed a second document toward him. It was a full, unconditional relinquishment of any and all claims to the Vance estate and holdings, transferring everything back to her, the rightful heir. He stared at the documents, then back at her, the architect of his ruin. There was no choice. With a trembling hand, he picked up the pen and signed away the kingdom he had stolen. The story ended not with a bang, but with the quiet scratch of a pen. Elara stood alone in the study long after he had gone. The late afternoon sun streamed through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. She walked over to the mantelpiece and picked up a silver-framed photograph of her and her father, taken years ago, their faces bright with laughter. The house was silent. It was hers again. The long Cold War was over. She hadn't just reclaimed an inheritance. She had reclaimed her father's honor, her future, and her name. She had brought the building down. And now, on the cleared ground, on the strong foundation he had left for her, she could finally begin to build again.